Imagine being sold to a stranger at age 12, beaten legally by your husband and facing a 1 in 3 chance of dying in childbirth, all while having absolutely no say in any of it. This was the terrifying reality for countless women in medieval Eldenmoor, where marriage wasn't about love, but survival, politics, and often brutal domination. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Hello there, gentle soul, and welcome to this quiet sanctuary of forgotten stories. Before we journey back to the shadowed halls and stone chambers of medieval times, I want to offer you the warmest of greetings on this peaceful evening. Whether you've settled into your favourite chair with a steaming cup of tea, or you're nestled beneath soft blankets preparing to drift into slumber, I'm truly grateful you've chosen to spend these moments with me tonight. I'd love to know, where in this wide world are you listening from right now? Are you watching the snow fall outside your window, or perhaps feeling a gentle breeze through an open door? What time of evening is it in your corner of the world? Please, take a moment to share in the comments below. There's something wonderfully comforting about knowing we're all gathered here together, a community of curious hearts drawn to the whispered secrets of ages past. And if you find solace in these gentle explorations of history's hidden corners, I'd be honoured if you'd consider subscribing. There are so many more forgotten tales waiting to be shared, each one a candle lit against the darkness of time. But for now, let the weight of today's concerns slip away like autumn leaves on a quiet stream. Allow yourself to step back through the mists of centuries to a time when the very notion of marriage held meanings we can scarcely comprehend today. A time when the phrase, "till death do us part," carried a far more immediate and terrifying weight than we might imagine. Picture, if you will, the rolling hills of medieval Valdres, where morning mist clings to ancient oak groves and stone cottages dot the countryside like scattered pearls. The year is 1347, and in the great manor house of Thornwick Castle, a young girl named Isadora is about to learn that her childhood has come to an abrupt and final end. She's barely seen 12 summers, still plays with cornhusk dolls in secret, and dreams of running through wildflower meadows with her younger sister Celeste. But today, her father Lord Aldrich will inform her that she's to be wed to a man she's never met, a man old enough to be her grandfather, living in a distant realm called Ravenshire. This is no fairy tale, dear listener. This is the harsh reality that awaited countless young women in the medieval world, where marriage was rarely about affection and almost never about choice. It was a business transaction, a political alliance, a way to secure lands and titles and bloodlines. The bride herself was often little more than a commodity to be bartered, her value measured not in her thoughts or dreams or desires, but in the size of her dowry and the fertility of her womb. In the candlelit chambers of Thornwick Castle, young Isadora's fate is being decided by men who see her not as a person, but as a piece on a vast chessboard of medieval politics. Her tears, her fears, her desperate pleas to remain with her family. None of these matter in the slightest. She will leave everything she has ever known to live with a stranger who has already buried 2 wives and who views her as nothing more than a vessel for producing male heirs. And Isadora's story, heartbreaking as it is, represents just one thread in the vast tapestry of medieval marriage. A tapestry woven with threads of fear, submission, violence, and often tragic early death. In the great cities of Corvain and Melbrook, in the farming villages scattered across the realm of Astoria, in the windswept castles of the northern kingdoms of Frostmere, similar scenes played out countless times. Young girls saying goodbye to their childhood, their freedom, and often their very lives, all in service to a system that saw them as little more than property to be traded. The marriage ceremonies themselves were often cold, formal affairs, political theatre rather than celebrations of love. Picture the great cathedral of Silverfall, its soaring arches echoing with the mechanical recitation of vows between strangers. The bride, perhaps trembling in her heavy silk gown, standing beside a man whose touch makes her skin crawl, surrounded by nobles who care nothing for her happiness, but everything for the alliance this union represents. But even after the vows were spoken and the political contracts signed, the true brutality was just beginning. For in the medieval world, a husband held complete and legal authority over his wife's body, her possessions, her very existence. She could be beaten, confined, or even killed with little to no legal consequences. The phrase, rule of thumb, allegedly comes from the medieval law, that a man could beat his wife with a stick, as long as it was no thicker than his thumb. Tonight, as we embark on this journey together, we'll explore the lives of women like Isadora, like the merchant's daughter, Rowena of Goldenhaven, who was wed at 13 to settle her father's debts, like the noble lady Evangeline of Moonhaven, who endured 7 pregnancies before dying in agony at age 24. These are not stories of romance and happily ever after. These are stories of survival, of quiet courage in the face of unimaginable hardship, of women who found ways to endure in a world designed to break them. So settle in, dear friend, and prepare yourself for a journey into the shadows of history, where love was a luxury few could afford, and marriage was often a sentence worse than death itself. And so we leave behind the comfort of our modern world, where love and choice guide our hearts toward partnership, where equality and respect form the foundation of lasting unions. How easy it is for us to take for granted the simple freedom to say yes or no to a suitor, to choose our own path in matters of the heart, to marry for love rather than obligation. But tonight, we must set aside these modern luxuries and step through the veil of time into a world far harsher and more unforgiving than most of us could ever imagine. A world where the very word marriage carried connotations that would chill us to the bone, where the sacred vows we associate with joy and celebration were often spoken through tears of terror and despair. Picture yourself walking away from everything familiar, the electric lights that banish darkness at the flip of a switch, the warm embrace of central heating that keeps winter's bite at bay, the certainty that your voice matters and your choices are your own. Leave behind the notion that marriage is a partnership between equals, that love conquers all, that happily ever after is even a possibility to be hoped for. Instead, imagine stepping into a world shrouded in perpetual twilight, where massive stone walls seem to press in from all sides, where the very air feels heavy with the weight of centuries-old traditions designed to crush the human spirit. This is medieval Astoria, a realm where church bells ring not with joy, but with the solemn toll of duty and submission, where the rustle of silk wedding gowns mingles with the desperate whispers of young girls pleading for mercy that will never come. The landscape before us is one of rolling hills, dotted with imposing castles, their towers reaching toward grey skies like accusing fingers. In the valleys below, villagers huddle together as if seeking protection from forces they cannot control. Smoke rises from countless chimneys, but it brings little warmth to the hearts of those dwelling within. For in this world, even the most basic human desires, for love, for choice, for dignity, are luxuries reserved for the very few. As we walk these ancient cobblestone paths, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, we begin to hear the sounds that defined this era. Not the gentle murmur of lovers exchanging sweet promises, but the harsh negotiations of fathers bartering away their daughters' futures. Not the laughter of brides preparing for their special day, but the muffled sobs of children who have just learned they will never see their families again. The great manor houses that dot this landscape are not homes filled with warmth and love, but strategic fortresses where alliances are forged and human lives are traded like pieces of property. Behind their imposing walls, in chambers lit only by flickering candles, the fate of countless young women is decided by men who view them as nothing more than vessels for producing heirs and securing political advantage. Here, in the shadow of Ravensholm Abbey, where monks chant their evening prayers in voices that echo through stone corridors, we begin to understand that marriage in this world serves purposes far removed from happiness or fulfillment. It is a tool of power, a weapon of control, a system designed to perpetuate the dominance of those who already hold sway over others. The wind that whistles through these ancient stones carries with it the ghosts of countless stories, of young girls torn from their mothers' arms, of women who died in agony giving birth to children they never wanted, of brides who discovered on their wedding night that their husband's love would be expressed through violence and domination. As the last rays of sunlight fade behind the towers of distant Ironhold Castle, and the first stars appear in the darkening sky above the kingdom of Nethermoor, we must prepare ourselves for what lies ahead. For we are about to witness a world where the most sacred of human bonds, the union between two people, has been twisted into something almost unrecognizable, something that would make even the strongest among us weep with rage and sorrow. The gentle brook that winds through the village of Millhaven babbles its ancient song, but even its voice seems mournful tonight, as if it too remembers the tears of countless brides who once walked along its banks on their way to futures they neither chose nor desired. The very stones beneath our feet seem to pulse with the accumulated anguish of generations of women who lived and died in service to a system that saw them as less than human. So let us steel ourselves, dear friend, for the journey that awaits us. Let us prepare our hearts for stories that will challenge everything we thought we knew about love and marriage and the bonds that tie us together. For in the world we are about to enter, such bonds are not ties of affection, but chains of bondage that few could ever hope to break. Tonight, we walk in the footsteps of those who came before us, those who endured what we could never imagine enduring, who found strength in places we might never think to look. Their stories deserve to be told, their suffering deserves to be remembered, and their quiet courage deserves to be honoured. The mists of time are parting before us now, revealing a world both fascinating and terrible, where the human capacity for both cruelty and endurance will be tested again and again. Welcome to medieval marriage, an institution that would make our modern hearts break with grief and rage. To truly understand the brutality of medieval marriage, we must first comprehend the vast web of laws, customs, and beliefs that shaped this institution across the kingdoms of Valdoria, Astonmere, and the northern reaches of Grimwald. This was not simply a matter of individual cruelty or personal misfortune, it was a systematic oppression woven into the very fabric of medieval society, sanctioned by law, blessed by the church, and enforced with the full weight of feudal authority. In the great legal codes that governed these realms, women existed in a state of perpetual legal childhood. The ancient laws of Eldenmoor, established in 1203 and enforced across 17 kingdoms, declared that a woman could never hold property in her own name, could never enter into contracts, could never even testify in court without a male guardian speaking on her behalf. From the moment of her birth until the day she died, she remained under the absolute authority of first her father, then her husband, and if widowed, her eldest son or nearest male relative. The Codex Matrimonialis, that dreaded legal document that governed marriage law throughout the realm of Thornshire and beyond, laid out the terms of this bondage in chilling detail. A father could legally sell his daughter into marriage from the age of 7, though consummation was typically delayed until she reached 12, not out of any concern for her well-being, but simply to ensure she would survive long enough to bear children. The bride price, that sum paid by the groom's family to secure the transaction, was calculated not based on the girl's intelligence, kindness, or character, but on her potential fertility, her father's political connections, and the size of her dowry. Consider the shocking mathematics of medieval marriage as recorded in the Chronicles of Westmarch Abbey. In the year 1348, the average age of first marriage for noble girls was just 13 years old. For peasant girls, who were considered ready for hard labour at an even younger age, it was often 11 or 12. These children, for that is what they were, would be handed over to men who might be 20, 30, or even 40 years their senior. The age gap was not merely accepted but preferred, as older husbands were deemed more capable of controlling their young wives and teaching them proper submission. The Church of Serenfall, that mighty institution which held sway over both earthly law and spiritual doctrine, provided divine justification for this system of oppression. The sacred texts kept in the monasteries of Blackmoor taught that women were inherently weak, inherently sinful, inherently in need of masculine guidance and discipline. The doctrine of conjugal submission, preached from pulpits across the land, declared that a wife's disobedience to her husband was not merely a crime against man, but a sin against God himself. Archbishop Cornelius of Winterhold, writing in his influential treatise, The Proper Ordering of Marriage in 1334, laid out the theological foundation for marital brutality with chilling precision. Just as Christ is the head of the church, he wrote, so must the husband be the unquestioned master of his wife. She must submit to his will in all things, bear his corrections with gratitude, and consider his pleasure before her own comfort. To question his authority is to question the divine order itself. The economic realities of medieval life further entrenched this system of female bondage. In the agricultural communities scattered across the fertile valleys of Goldenvale and Silver Peak, a family's survival often depended on strategic marriage alliances. Daughters were investments to be carefully managed and ultimately traded for maximum advantage. The merchant guilds of Coppertown and Ironbridge maintained detailed records of eligible girls, listing their assets like livestock. Daughter of Mason Garrett, 14 years, good teeth, wide hips suitable for childbearing, dowry includes 2 milk cows and 40 silver marks. The practice of hand fasting, common in the northern territories of Frostmere, allowed men to essentially rent wives for trial periods. A man could take a young woman into his household, use her sexually for a year and a day, and then return her to her family if she failed to produce a child or proved otherwise unsatisfactory. These discarded women, marked forever by their shame, rarely found other suitors and often ended their days as servants or beggars. Perhaps most shocking of all was the legal doctrine known as coverture, which declared that upon marriage, a woman's legal identity was completely absorbed into that of her husband. She ceased to exist as an individual in the eyes of the law. Her property became his property, her debts became his debts, and her body became his to use as he saw fit. The legal scholar Magistrate Aldwin of Ravencrest explained it thus in his judicial writings. In marriage, the husband and wife become one person in law, and that person is the husband. The courts of Eldenmoor and Thornvale regularly heard cases that would horrify us today, yet were considered routine matters of household management. Husbands could legally confine their wives to towers or cellars for weeks at a time as punishment for disobedience. They could prevent their wives from seeing family members, from learning to read, from leaving the house without permission. The infamous case of the merchant's wife, tried in the Royal Court of Ashford in 1356, established the legal precedent that a husband could even sell his wife's clothing and jewellery to pay his gambling debts, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back. Violence within marriage was not merely tolerated but actively encouraged as a tool of proper household management. The rule of thumb, that notorious legal principle, specified that a husband could beat his wife with any implement no thicker than his thumb. The city records of Millbrook contain dozens of entries recording wives who died from such corrections, their deaths ruled accidental or justified based on their alleged disobedience. The birth and death records kept by the scribes of Moonhaven Abbey paint a particularly grim picture of the fate awaiting young brides. Of every 10 women who married before age 15, 3 would die in childbirth before reaching 25. Another 2 would die from complications of repeated pregnancies, domestic violence, or the grinding poverty that consumed most medieval households. Only half would live to see their 30th birthday, and of these survivors, most would be worn down to shadows of their former selves, aged far beyond their years by constant childbearing, back-breaking labour, and the crushing weight of absolute powerlessness. This, then, was the world into which countless young girls were thrust, a world where their dreams and desires counted for nothing, where their bodies belonged to others, where their very existence was measured solely by their ability to produce male heirs and serve their husbands' needs. It was a system as comprehensive as it was cruel, touching every aspect of life from the humblest peasant cottage to the most magnificent royal palace. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In the autumn of 1362, the Great Hall of Thornfield Manor witnessed one of the most documented and tragic examples of medieval marriage brutality. The wedding of Lady Cordelia of Ravens Hollow to Lord Bartholomew the Grim of Blackstone Keep. This union, recorded in exhaustive detail by the court chronicler, Brother Benedict of Willowmere, serves as a perfect illustration of how the systematic oppression of women played out in the lives of real people, destroying lives and dreams with methodical precision. Lady Cordelia was barely 14 when her fate was sealed, though she had been promised in marriage since the age of 7. The daughter of Earl Magnus of Ravens Hollow, she had grown up in the relative comfort of her father's castle, tutored by learned women who had taught her to read Latin, to play the lute, and to compose poetry. She was, by all accounts, a bright and spirited girl who dreamed of perhaps entering a convent where she could pursue her love of learning, or at the very least marrying someone kind who might allow her to maintain correspondence with the scholars at the Abbey of Sacred Heart. But Lady Cordelia's dreams were worth nothing against the political realities that governed her world. Her father owed massive debts to Lord Bartholomew, incurred during a disastrous military campaign against the rebellious lords of Grimwald. The marriage contract, negotiated over ale and roasted meat in smoky taverns, was brutally simple. Cordelia's hand in exchange for the forgiveness of debts totalling 3,000 silver marks, plus a military alliance that would protect Earl Magnus from his enemies. Lord Bartholomew himself was a man of 43 years, already twice widowed under circumstances that raised whispers throughout the northern kingdoms. His first wife, Lady Gwyneth of Stormhaven, had died in childbirth at 16, though servants whispered that her bruises suggested she'd been severely beaten shortly before going into labour. His second wife, the gentle Lady Marianne of Goldbrook, had lasted only 2 years before succumbing to what the physician termed a wasting sickness of the spirit. Though the kitchen maid spoke quietly of how she had grown thin and haunted, jumping at shadows and refusing to eat. The marriage negotiations, as recorded in the ledger of contracts held at Thornfield Manor, reveal the cold calculation behind this union. Lord Bartholomew's representatives demanded proof of Cordelia's virginity, her ability to bear children, and a detailed inventory of her dowry, which included 200 acres of fertile farmland, 50 head of cattle, a chest of silver plate, and the hereditary right to collect taxes from 3 small villages. In return, they offered protection for Earl Magnus and a promise that Cordelia would be properly disciplined and instructed in wifely duties. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a nightmare of preparation that Cordelia endured like a condemned prisoner awaiting execution. The seamstresses fitted her for a wedding gown of deep blue silk, blue being the colour of submission and obedience, while she stood silent and pale as marble. Her mother, Lady Isabel, wept constantly but dared not oppose the match, for she too had learned the hard way that a woman's tears counted for nothing against male authority. Brother Benedict's chronicle describes the final night before the wedding with heartbreaking detail. Cordelia spent the evening in the castle chapel, kneeling before the altar and praying desperately for deliverance that would never come. Her younger sister, 10-year-old Rosalind, found her there just before dawn, sobbing into her hands. "Please, Rosie," Cordelia whispered, "promise me you'll remember me as I am now, not as what I'll become." The words proved more prophetic than either girl could have imagined. The wedding ceremony itself took place on a grey October morning, with rain drumming against the stained glass windows of St. Aldrich's Cathedral in the town of Millbrook. Lord Bartholomew arrived with a retinue of 30 armed men, making it clear that this was as much a military occupation as a wedding celebration. He wore black armour even in the sacred space of the cathedral, his face hidden behind a helm decorated with the skull of a wolf, a symbol that would come to haunt Cordelia's nightmares. When Cordelia walked down the aisle, supported by her father who could barely meet her eyes, witnesses later said she moved like a ghost, her face completely drained of colour. The wedding vows, spoken in Latin that she understood all too well, included promises that would have been considered contracts of slavery in any other context. She swore to obey without question, submit without resistance, and bear children without complaint. When asked if she took Bartholomew as her husband, her voice was so quiet that the priest had to ask her to repeat the words 3 times. The wedding feast that followed was a grotesque celebration of a transaction completed. Lord Bartholomew's men drank heavily and sang crude songs about breaking young horses and taming wild spirits. The groom himself consumed enormous quantities of wine while regaling the guests with stories of his previous marriages, describing in disturbing detail how he had corrected his wife's behavioural problems. Cordelia sat beside him throughout the meal, touching neither food nor drink, staring ahead with eyes that seemed to see nothing. The most chilling moment of the evening came during the traditional blessing of the marriage bed. As was customary, the priest blessed the chamber where the marriage would be consummated while the wedding guests looked on. Brother Benedict noted that when the priest spoke the words, "May this union be fruitful and blessed," Cordelia began to tremble so violently that her chair shook. She had to be physically supported when it came time to leave the hall. What happened in the wedding chamber that night was never officially recorded, but the servants who cleaned the room the next morning whispered of bloodstains that suggested violence far beyond what was normal even by medieval standards. Cordelia emerged the next day with bruises on her throat and arms, moving carefully as if in great pain. When her personal maid, faithful old Gwendolen, who had cared for her since childhood, tried to tend to her injuries, Cordelia simply said, "This is my life now. We must not speak of it again." The transformation was swift and devastating. Within weeks, the bright, curious girl who had once filled the halls of Ravenshollow with laughter and music had become a silent shadow. She spoke only when directly addressed, kept her eyes downcast at all times, and developed a nervous habit of flinching whenever anyone approached her suddenly. The letters she had once written to her scholarly friends at the Abbey stopped completely, Her loot gathered dust in a corner of her chamber, never to be touched again. Lord Bartholomew, meanwhile, seemed to take perverse pleasure in displaying his complete dominance over his young wife. At public gatherings, he would deliberately contradict her when she spoke, order her to perform menial tasks in front of guests, and make crude jokes about the proper training he was providing her. The Chronicle of Blackstone Keep records that he frequently locked her in the tower chamber for days at a time, as punishment for infractions as minor as looking directly at male guests or speaking without permission. This, then, was how the systematic brutality of medieval marriage played out in individual lives, not as abstract legal concepts or theological principles, but as the daily destruction of human beings, the methodical crushing of spirits, the transformation of bright young women into hollow-eyed ghosts of their former selves. Lady Cordelia's story was neither unique nor exceptional. It was simply one thread in the vast tapestry of suffering that defined medieval marriage for countless women across the kingdoms of Valdoria and beyond. Let us now step closer to the hearth fires and chamber doors, into the most private moments of medieval marriage, where the true cost of this institution was measured not in silver marks or political alliances, but in the quiet desperation of individual women whose stories have been whispered down through the centuries by those brave enough to remember. In the village of Thornbury, nestled in the shadow of the great castle of Elmwood, lived a baker's daughter named Margot. At 15, she possessed what the village women called dangerous beauty, golden hair that caught sunlight like spun silk, eyes the colour of summer meadows, and a laugh that could make even the grimmest merchant smile. But beauty, as Margot would learn, was not a gift, but a curse in a world where women were valued only for what men could take from them. Margot's daily life before marriage had been filled with simple pleasures that we might barely notice but which meant everything to her. Each morning she would rise before dawn to help her father knead the bread, her hands working the dough while she hummed old songs her grandmother had taught her. She loved the way the wheat smelled as it transformed into sustenance, loved watching the faces of children when she slipped them extra honey cakes, loved the independence of earning her own small coins by selling her special pastries at the market square. On market days, she would walk through the village with her friend Eliza, a weaver's daughter, and they would dream together of impossible things. Perhaps they might save enough coins to travel to the great city of Silvermark, where Eliza had heard there were schools that would teach women to read and write. Or maybe they could join the convent at Rosehaven, where the nuns were said to run their own brewery and actually made decisions about their own lives. These dreams seem precious now, when we know how brutally they would be shattered. The turning point came when Lord Aldwyn of Elmwood noticed Margot selling her pastries in the market. He was a man of 38, already widowed once, known throughout the region for his violent temper and his treatment of servants. But he was also wealthy, powerful, and unaccustomed to being denied anything he desired. Within a week of first seeing her, he had approached Margot's father with an offer that was both generous and terrifying. He would take Margot as his wife, pay off the family's debts to the grain merchant, and guarantee protection from the bandits who had been raiding farms throughout the region. Margot's father, Thomas the baker, was a kind man who genuinely loved his daughter, but he was also drowning in debt and terrified for his family's survival. The grain merchant had threatened to have him thrown in debtor's prison, which would have left Margot and her younger brothers homeless and starving. With tears streaming down his weathered face, Thomas agreed to the marriage, knowing he was condemning his beloved daughter to save the rest of his family. The night before her wedding, Margot sat in the small chamber above the bakery that had been her entire world, carefully packing away the few possessions she would be allowed to take with her. Her hands trembled as she folded the blue dress her mother had sewn for her last birthday, the one she'd worn while dancing at the harvest festival, when she still believed her future held joy. She packed her small collection of pressed flowers, each one a memory of walks through meadows she would never see again. Most precious of all was a small wooden box containing the coins she had saved from selling her pastries, coins that would now belong to her husband, like everything else about her. Eliza came to bid her farewell, and the two friends clung to each other, both understanding that this was not just goodbye but the death of who Margot had been. "Promise me," Margot whispered through her tears. "Promise me you'll remember the girl who used to laugh with you. Promise me that when I'm gone, you'll still remember that she existed." Eliza promised, though her own heart was breaking, knowing that she too would likely face a similar fate within a year or two. The wedding night was a trauma that Margot would carry with her for the rest of her brief life. Lord Aldwyn had been drinking heavily throughout the wedding feast, regaling his guests with crude jokes about breaking in young fillies and teaching proper obedience. When he finally dragged Margot to the marriage chamber, he made it clear that he viewed her not as a person to be loved, but as property to be used. The violence of that night left her injured and bleeding, but when she dared to cry out in pain, he struck her across the face and told her that making noise would only make things worse for her. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of fear and submission. Margot quickly learned the rules of her new existence. She must never speak unless spoken to, never leave the castle grounds without permission, never refuse her husband's demands no matter how degrading or painful they might be. Her day began before sunrise, when she was expected to help the kitchen servants prepare Lord Aldwyn's breakfast exactly as he liked it. She spent her mornings doing needlework in the cold solar, her fingers often numb and pricked bloody from trying to maintain perfect stitches while fighting back tears. But perhaps the cruelest torment was the way her husband systematically destroyed every connection to her former self. When he discovered her collection of pressed flowers, he threw them into the fire while laughing at her tears. When she hummed one of her grandmother's songs while working, he forbade her from ever making music again, saying that such frivolity was unseemly in a married woman. He even banned her from baking, claiming that such common labour was beneath the dignity of his wife, though they both knew the real reason was that he could not bear to see her find even a moment's joy in anything. The physical abuse escalated with each passing week. A slap for looking out the window too long became a beating for dropping. A sewing needle became confinement in the cold cellar for the crime of flinching when he raised his hand. Margot learned to read the signs of his moods, the particular way he clenched his jaw when he was looking for an excuse to hit something, the tone of voice that meant she should make herself as small and invisible as possible, the sound of his footsteps that warned her to brace for whatever was coming. In the village below, her friend Eliza would sometimes catch glimpses of Margot during her rare supervised visits to the market. The transformation was heartbreaking to witness. The girl who had once moved with confidence and joy now kept her eyes fixed on the ground, flinched at sudden movements, and spoke in barely audible whispers. Her golden hair, once her pride, was always covered now by a severe wimple that hid most of her face. But Eliza could see the bruises that darkened her friend's wrists, could notice how carefully Margot moved as if her ribs were tender, could recognise the hollow look in her eyes that spoke of a spirit being systematically destroyed. The most tragic aspect of Margot's story was not the physical violence, devastating as it was, but the complete erasure of her identity. The girl who had once dreamed of travelling to distant cities now cowered in fear at the thought of leaving her chamber. The young woman who had delighted in creating beautiful pastries now spent her days in mechanical repetition of tasks designed to break her will. The daughter who had laughed with friends now lived in complete isolation, forbidden from maintaining any relationships that might remind her of who she used to be. When Margot became pregnant 6 months after her marriage, she experienced none of the joy that might have accompanied the news in different circumstances. Instead, she was terrified, knowing that pregnancy would make her even more vulnerable to her husband's violence and that childbirth itself might kill her. She had already witnessed what happened to Lord Aldwyn's first wife, who had died screaming in agony during a difficult labour while he stood outside the birthing chamber, drunk and complaining about the noise she was making. As winter settled over the castle of Elmwood, Margot would sometimes stand at her chamber window, looking out at the village where she had once been happy, and wonder if the girl she used to be had ever really existed at all. The memories seemed like dreams now, too bright and beautiful to have been real. In the depth of her despair, she could not imagine that anyone would ever remember her story, could not foresee that centuries later people would speak her name with sadness and rage, honouring the spirit that had been so brutally crushed but never quite extinguished. Even in the darkest corners of medieval marriage, where individual women suffered in isolation and terror, there existed hidden networks of support and understanding, fragile webs of connection that women wove in the shadows, creating bonds that could mean the difference between survival and complete despair. These were not official institutions or recognised support systems, but rather the quiet solidarity of women who understood each other's suffering because they lived it themselves. In the great castle of Ravenscroft, home to Lord Garrett of Shadowmere and his collection of wives, sisters, and female servants, an intricate system of silent communication had developed over the years. The women had learned to read each other's faces, to understand the meaning behind a quickly averted gaze or a carefully placed hand gesture. When Lady Helena, Lord Garrett's third wife, appeared at morning prayers with fresh bruises around her throat, the other women knew without words what had transpired in the master's chamber the night before. The castle's head cook, a woman named Agnes Fairfax, who had served 3 generations of brutal lords, had become the unofficial keeper of women's secrets and sorrows. Her kitchen served as a sanctuary of sorts, where the female servants could gather under the pretense of their duties while actually providing each other with the emotional support that was forbidden everywhere else in the castle. Agnes herself had been married at 12 to a blacksmith who had beaten her so severely that she lost 3 children before they were born. When her husband finally died of fever, she had taken refuge in service rather than risk another marriage. It was Agnes who taught the younger women how to hide their bruises with careful arrangement of their clothing, how to muffle their cries during beating so as not to anger their husbands further, and most importantly, how to protect any female children they might bear from meeting the same fate. She kept a small collection of herbs in her private stores, some for preventing pregnancy when a woman was too injured or ill to survive childbirth, others for easing the pain of recovery from violent encounters, and still others for the merciful task of helping women who had decided they could no longer endure their lives. In the village of Millhaven, the women had developed their own networks of support centred around the public well where they gathered each morning to draw water. Here, in the few precious minutes when they were away from their husbands' watchful eyes, they could exchange information that might save lives. Goodwife Martha would whisper warnings about which men in the village had been drinking heavily and were likely to come home violent. Young Bridget would share remedies for the injuries that all of them understood without needing explicit explanation. Most importantly, they would watch out for each other's daughters, trying to delay marriages when possible, or at least ensuring that girls entered their new households with whatever meagre protection could be provided. The midwives of the realm occupied a unique position in these networks of female support. Women like Dame Constance of Willowbrook, who attended births throughout the countryside, served as unofficial counsellors and protectors of women's secrets. They had seen firsthand the devastation that violent husbands could wreak on pregnant women, had held the hands of young girls barely out of childhood as they died in agony giving birth to children conceived through rape, had witnessed the particular cruelty of men who would beat their wives even during labour. Dame Constance carried with her not only the tools of her trade but also a wealth of knowledge passed down through generations of women who had learned to survive in a world designed to destroy them. She knew which herbs could prevent a pregnancy from taking hold when a woman was too weak to carry another child, which techniques could ease a difficult birth when the husband refused to allow physicians to attend, and which prayers might give comfort to women facing death in childbirth, while their husbands waited outside, concerned only about the inheritance implications of their wives' survival. But perhaps most importantly, Dame Constance served as a keeper of stories. In her travels from village to village, castle to cottage, she carried with her the memories of countless women, their names, their struggles, their small victories and their tragic defeats. She would whisper these stories to other women during the long hours of labour, reminding them that they were not alone in their suffering, that countless others had endured similar trials, and that their own pain was worthy of remembrance and respect. The religious communities offered another form of support, though one that came with its own dangers and limitations. The convent of St. Agatha in the hills above Goldenvale had become a refuge for women who could find no other escape from brutal marriages. Mother Superior Beatrice, herself a former wife who had fled to religious life after her husband's death, understood the desperation that drove women to seek sanctuary behind convent walls. She had developed elaborate schemes to help women fake their own deaths, or disappear during pilgrimages, allowing them to begin new lives under assumed names in distant monasteries. Sister Mary Catherine, the convent's herbalist, maintained a secret correspondence with women throughout the region, providing them with medicines and advice that could mean the difference between life and death. Her letters, written in a cipher known only to a select group of women, contained instructions for treating the kinds of injuries that no respectable physician would acknowledge, remedies for the depression and madness that often consumed women trapped in violent marriages, and most controversially, Methods for preventing or ending pregnancies when carrying a child would be tantamount to a death sentence. The marriage customs themselves had created unexpected opportunities for female solidarity. The tradition of the Women's Council, where the female relatives of a bride would gather on the eve of her wedding to prepare her for marriage, had evolved into something far more significant than its original ceremonial purpose. These gatherings became opportunities for older women to share practical survival strategies with young brides, to form alliances that might provide protection in the future, and to create bonds that could transcend the isolation that marriage typically imposed. Lady Margaret of Thornfield, mother to 3 daughters who had all been married against their will, used these councils to establish what she privately called her network of mothers. She maintained correspondence with the mothers-in-law and female relatives of her daughters' husbands, creating a web of information and mutual support that allowed the women to monitor each other's welfare and intervene when possible. When her youngest daughter Rosalind was beaten so severely by her husband that she could not walk, it was this network that arranged for her to be visiting family for several months while she recovered, away from her husband's immediate reach. The servants' quarters in great houses became unofficial sanctuaries where women could speak freely about their experiences and provide each other with practical support. Ladies' maids, kitchen servants, and chambermaids developed their own hierarchies of protection, with older women taking younger ones under their wing and teaching them the skills necessary for survival in households where violence was the norm. They shared techniques for reading their masters' moods, for avoiding dangerous situations, and for protecting their own bodies and those of the women they served. These networks extended beyond individual households and villages, creating a vast, if invisible, community of women who understood each other's plight. Travelling merchants' wives would carry messages between communities, pilgrims would share stories and strategies with women they met along their journeys, and even the female entertainers who moved from castle to castle served as conduits of information and support. But perhaps the most important function of these communities was simply bearing witness to women's experiences. In a world where women's suffering was considered natural and unremarkable, where their stories were deemed unworthy of official record, these networks ensured that their voices would not be completely silenced. They remembered the names of women who had died in childbirth, honoured those who had shown exceptional courage in the face of impossible circumstances, and passed down the wisdom that each generation of women had gained through their suffering. The bonds formed within these communities were often stronger than family ties, forged as they were in the crucible of shared trauma and mutual dependence. Women who might never have spoken to each other under normal circumstances found themselves united by their common understanding of what it meant to be property rather than person, to live in constant fear of violence, to watch their daughters face the same fate they had endured. But even the most carefully constructed networks of female support could not shield women from the crushing realities of a legal and social system designed to ensure their complete subjugation. For every small victory, every moment of solidarity, every act of quiet rebellion, there were devastating consequences that served as stark reminders of just how powerless women truly were in the medieval world of marriage. The case of Lady Vivian of Greystone illustrates the terrible price that women paid when they dared to resist the system that enslaved them. Married at 14 to Sir Edmund the Cruel of Blackmoor, Lady Vivian had endured 5 years of savage beatings, forced pregnancies, and psychological torment that had already claimed the lives of 2 of her infant children. When she finally found the courage to seek help from the underground network of women at court, attempting to arrange sanctuary at a distant convent, her husband's spies discovered the plot. The punishment was swift and devastating. Sir Edmund had Lady Vivian publicly flogged in the courtyard of Blackmoor Castle, her back laid open with 30 lashes, while her servants and the local peasantry were forced to watch. But the physical agony was only the beginning. He then had her confined to the castle's highest tower, chained to the wall like an animal, fed only bread and water, forbidden from seeing sunlight or speaking to another human being for 6 months. When she was finally released, her mind had been so broken by the isolation and brutality that she never spoke another coherent word, spending her remaining years rocking back and forth in her chamber, her eyes empty of all recognition or hope. The women who had tried to help her faced their own cruel retribution. Dame Margaret, the court herbalist who had provided Lady Vivian with medicines to prevent pregnancy, was accused of witchcraft and burned alive in the market square of Millbrook. The servant girl who had carried their secret messages was sold to a brothel, in the distant port city of Grimhofen, never to be seen again. The network that had taken years to build was shattered in a single week of violence and terror. Such examples serve their intended purpose, spreading fear throughout the female communities and reminding women of the devastating consequences of resistance. The legal system provided no protection whatsoever for women who sought to escape their circumstances. The courts of Valdoria operated under the principle that a wife's attempt to leave her husband constituted theft of herself, which was legally his property. Women who fled their marriages could be hunted down like runaway slaves, returned to their husbands, and punished with complete legal impunity. The Church, which might have been expected to provide some sanctuary for the desperate, instead served as another instrument of oppression. The doctrine preached from pulpits throughout the realm held that a woman's suffering in marriage was divinely ordained, a necessary penance for the original sin of Eve. The influential writings of Archbishop Roderick of Stormhaven declared that a wife who seeks to escape her husband's authority rebels not merely against man, but against God himself, and such rebellion must be crushed with righteous fury. Even the convents which had provided refuge for some desperate women faced increasing pressure from both secular and religious authorities to turn away wives seeking sanctuary. The Council of Ashford, convened in 1371, established new laws requiring abbesses to return any married woman to her husband within 3 days, or face excommunication and the seizure of their monastery's lands. Mother Superior Beatrice of St. Agatha, who had helped so many women escape their tormentors, was herself arrested and imprisoned for harbouring stolen property, the legal term for wives who had fled their marriages. The economic realities of medieval life created another seemingly insurmountable obstacle to women's freedom. Even if a woman could somehow escape her marriage, she had no legal right to property, no ability to work in most trades, and no means of supporting herself independently. The guild systems that controlled most forms of commerce explicitly excluded women from membership, making it virtually impossible for them to earn a living wage. A woman alone was automatically suspect, assumed to be either a runaway wife, a prostitute, or a witch, any of which could result in imprisonment, violence, or death. The story of Goodwife Eleanor of Millhaven demonstrates the impossible choices that faced women who sought independence. After her husband drank himself to death, leaving her with 3 young children and massive debts, Eleanor attempted to continue operating his small carpentry shop. She had learned the trade by watching and helping him for 15 years, and was actually more skilled than many of the official guild members. But when she applied for admission to the Carpenters' Guild of Goldenvale, she was not only rejected but publicly humiliated, with the guildmaster declaring that no woman shall sully the noble craft of woodworking with her inferior and unclean hands. Unable to work legally in her trade, Eleanor watched helplessly as creditors seized her tools, her home, and finally her children, who were sold into indentured servitude to pay her late husband's debts. She herself was forced into prostitution, the only occupation readily available to women without male protection. Within 2 years, she had died of disease in the brothels of Grimhaven, her children scattered to unknown fates, her skills and knowledge lost forever. The medical practices of the time created another source of torment for married women. The physicians of the realm, all of the men trained in the classical texts that viewed women as inherently defective versions of men, treated their female patients not as individuals deserving care, but as breeding animals whose primary function was reproduction. The medical schools of Ravensburg and Thornshire taught that women's bodies were designed specifically to endure pain, that their suffering during childbirth and at their husbands' hands was natural and beneficial, serving to strengthen their moral character and prepare their souls for salvation. Dr. Aldwyn of Blackstone, the most respected physician in the northern kingdoms, wrote extensively about the treatment of disobedient wives. His recommended remedies included bloodletting to drain away the excessive humours that caused women to rebel against their husbands, trepanation to release the evil vapours that led to independent thinking, and forced pregnancy as a cure for the unnatural desire for learning or freedom that sometimes afflicted women. These practices were not considered torture, but legitimate medical treatment, endorsed by the Church and enforced by law. The isolation imposed by marriage created perhaps the most insidious obstacle to women's resistance. Cut off from their families, forbidden from maintaining friendships, prevented from travelling or communicating freely, married women were systematically stripped of all social connections that might have provided support or validation. This isolation was not accidental, but deliberately engineered to break women's spirits and eliminate any possibility of collective resistance. Lady Catherine of Windermere, married to Lord Hugo the Merciless, described her experience in a secret diary that was discovered centuries later, hidden in the walls of Windermere Castle. "I have not spoken to another woman in 8 months," she wrote. "My husband has forbidden me from visiting my sister, from corresponding with my childhood friends, from attending the village markets where I might encounter familiar faces. I begin to wonder if I am losing my mind, if the person I once was ever truly existed, or if I have always been nothing more than the empty vessel he tells me I am." The systematic destruction of women's identities through forced isolation was perhaps the most effective tool of oppression in the medieval marriage system. Women who might have found strength in numbers were deliberately kept apart, each one made to believe that her suffering was unique, that her resistance was futile, that her dreams of freedom were the delusions of a diseased mind. The pregnancies that were forced upon married women served as another form of imprisonment, binding them to their husbands through physical vulnerability and economic dependence. The average married woman in medieval Valdoria would endure between 8 and 15 pregnancies during her reproductive years, with each pregnancy increasing her risk of death and further limiting her ability to resist or escape. The constant cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, and nursing created a state of perpetual physical weakness and emotional exhaustion that made resistance nearly impossible. Even the few legal protections that theoretically existed for women proved worthless in practice. The law stated that a husband could not kill his wife outright, but it also held that he was not responsible for her death if it resulted from reasonable correction that went too far. The definition of reasonable correction was so broad as to be meaningless, encompassing everything from beatings with clubs to confinement in freezing chambers to forced starvation as punishment for disobedience. Yet even in the darkest depths of medieval marriage, where hope seemed as fragile as morning frost, there flickered moments of extraordinary courage and triumph that illuminate the indomitable nature of the human spirit. These were not grand victories that changed the system, for such changes would not come for centuries, but small, precious acts of defiance and love that proved that even the most brutal oppression could not completely extinguish the light within the human heart. In the remote mountain village of Thornspire there lived a young woman named Seraphina, whose story became legend among the women of the northern valleys. Married at 13 to Gareth the Iron Fist, a wool merchant known for his cruelty, Seraphina endured 2 years of savage beatings and forced labour that left her body scarred and her spirit seemingly broken. But deep within her, a flame of rebellion continued to burn, fed by memories of her grandmother's stories about the ancient queens who had once ruled these lands with wisdom and strength. Seraphina's moment of triumph came not through escape or rescue, but through an act of such stunning boldness that it shocked the entire region. When her husband struck her during a public market day, knocking her to the ground before dozens of witnesses, she did not cower or flee as expected. Instead, she rose to her feet, looked him directly in the eyes, and spoke words that would be whispered in kitchens and spinning rooms for generations. "I am not your property, Gareth the Coward. I am a daughter of the mountain queens, and you will never break me." The crowd fell silent, expecting to witness her immediate execution. But something in Seraphina's bearing, something in the ancient power that seemed to flow through her words, gave even the brutal Gareth pause. For the first time in his life he found himself backing away from a woman, and in that moment of hesitation Seraphina walked away from him, through the stunned crowd, and disappeared into the mountain forests where she had played as a child. What followed was a manhunt that lasted 3 months, but Seraphina had vanished as completely as if the earth itself had swallowed her. Years later, travellers would speak of a mysterious woman who lived alone in a cave high in the mountains, who had learned to survive by her wits and courage, who helped other women fleeing their marriages by guiding them through secret mountain passes to safety in distant lands. Whether these stories were true or merely wishful thinking on the part of oppressed women, they served a vital purpose. They proved that escape was possible, that the system was not absolute, that freedom, however dangerous and difficult, could be achieved. In the great city of Ravensburg, another kind of triumph unfolded in the house of Master Edmund, a wealthy spice merchant who had married his 4th wife, a young woman named Lysandra, after his previous 3 wives had all died in mysterious circumstances. Lysandra quickly realized that she was likely intended to meet the same fate, but instead of accepting her doom, she began to plan with the calculating patience of a chess master. Using her position as the merchant's wife, Lysandra slowly gained the trust of the household servants, learning the secrets of her husband's business dealings, including his involvement in illegal smuggling operations that could see him hanged if discovered by the authorities. She also began carefully documenting the evidence of his previous wives' murders, gathering testimonies from servants who had witnessed his crimes, collecting the poison bottles he kept hidden in his private chambers. But Lysandra's true genius lay not in gathering evidence, but in understanding how to use the medieval system's own rules against itself. She carefully cultivated relationships with the wives of her husband's business partners, particularly Lady Meredith, wife of the city's chief magistrate. Through seemingly innocent conversations during social gatherings, Lysandra planted seeds of suspicion about her husband's activities, suggesting that his mysterious wealth might threaten the stability of other merchants' enterprises. When Master Edmund finally attempted to poison Lysandra as he had his previous wives, she was ready. Having switched the contents of his poison bottle with a harmless sleeping draught, she pretended to die, lying motionless while he celebrated his supposed success. But as he slept off his victory feast, Lysandra rose from her deathbed and set in motion the plan she'd spent months preparing. By dawn, the city magistrates were pounding on Master Edmund's door, armed with evidence of his smuggling operations, testimonies about the murders of his wives, and the support of the merchant community who'd been convinced that he posed a threat to their own prosperity. The case was so overwhelming that even the corrupt courts of Ravensburg could not ignore it. Master Edmund was executed within a week, and Lysandra, legally declared a widow, inherited his entire fortune. But Lysandra's triumph extended far beyond her personal victory. Using her newfound wealth and position, she established what she called the Sisterhood of St. Catherine, ostensibly a religious charitable organisation that provided aid to widows and orphans. In reality, it served as an elaborate network for helping women escape abusive marriages, providing them with new identities, safe houses, and the financial resources needed to start new lives in distant cities. The sisterhood operated with remarkable sophistication, maintaining safe houses in 7 different cities, employing former soldiers as guards, and even establishing legitimate businesses that could provide employment for women who needed to support themselves independently. Over the 15 years of its operation, the sisterhood helped more than 300 women escape their marriages, creating a legend that spread throughout the kingdom and inspired similar organisations in other regions. In the Abbey of St. Brigid, Mother Superior Adelheid achieved perhaps the most significant institutional triumph against the marriage system of her era. When the Council of Bishops attempted to force her convent to return escaped wives to their husbands, Adelheid did not simply resist. She fought back with the weapons of law and theology, demonstrating a brilliance that left even her male opponents grudgingly respectful. Adelheid's strategy was masterful in its use of the Church's own doctrines against the marriage system. She argued that marriage was a sacrament that could be dissolved if one party had committed mortal sin, and she documented cases where husbands had clearly violated Christian law through their treatment of their wives. More boldly, she claimed that the convent had the right to provide sanctuary to any woman seeking to dedicate her life to God, regardless of her marital status, citing ancient church precedents that predated the current marriage laws. The legal battle that followed lasted 3 years and involved bishops, abbots, and even papal representatives. But Adelheid had done her research thoroughly, building her arguments on solid theological ground and backing them with meticulous documentation of abuse cases. When the final ruling came down, it established new precedents that allowed convents throughout the realm to provide sanctuary to women fleeing violent marriages, at least temporarily. Perhaps most remarkably, Adelheid used the controversy to establish the first formal schools for women in the northern kingdoms. Arguing that women needed education to properly serve God, she created institutions where girls could learn to read, write, and study theology, skills that gave them alternatives to marriage and the independence to make their own choices about their lives. The individual acts of courage performed by countless unnamed women also deserve recognition as triumphs of the human spirit. There was the merchant's wife in Goldenvale, who secretly taught reading to young girls, preparing them with skills that might help them survive in a hostile world. There was the midwife in Silverbrook who refused to perform procedures that would have killed female infants, saving dozens of girls from infanticide. There was the baker's daughter who composed and secretly circulated songs that celebrated women's strength and courage, keeping alive the memory that women were capable of greatness. In the castle of Moonhaven, Lady Rosalind discovered that her husband's cruelty extended to their young daughter, whom he had begun grooming for marriage to a known violent man when the child was only 8 years old. Instead of accepting this fate, Lady Rosalind staged an elaborate deception, convincing her husband that their daughter had died of fever, while actually smuggling the child to safety with relatives in a distant kingdom. For 10 years, she maintained the fiction of her daughter's death, even going so far as to hold annual memorial services, while secretly corresponding with the girl and ensuring her safety and education. These triumphs, small though they might seem against the vast machinery of oppression, served a purpose far greater than their immediate impact. They proved that the system was not invincible, that women were not naturally suited for subjugation, that with courage, intelligence, and determination, even the most powerless could find ways to resist, and sometimes even to win. Most importantly, they provided hope and inspiration to other women, showing them that they were not alone in their suffering and that alternatives to submission were possible, however dangerous they might be. As the medieval period drew toward its close, the very foundations of the marriage system that had crushed so many women for centuries began to show the first hairline cracks that would eventually bring about its transformation. These changes did not come suddenly or dramatically, but emerged slowly through the accumulation of countless individual acts of resistance, the gradual shift in economic realities, and the emergence of new ideas about human dignity that would ultimately reshape the institution of marriage itself. The Great Plague that swept through the kingdoms of Valdoria and Aston Mere in the late 14th century, devastating as it was, inadvertently created opportunities for women that had never existed before. With perhaps a third of the population dead or dying, traditional social structures began to collapse under the weight of necessity. Villages that had once maintained rigid hierarchies found themselves desperate for any hands that could work regardless of gender. Women who had been confined to their husbands' homes suddenly found themselves needed as merchants, artisans, and even administrators of estates whose male heirs had perished. In the town of Millbrook, the widow Constance Ashford found herself inheriting not only her late husband's bakery, but also his seat on the town council, simply because there were no male relatives left alive to claim it. What began as a temporary necessity gradually became accepted practice, and Constance used her position to pass the first laws in the region that limited a husband's right to beat his wife and required witnesses for marriage contracts to ensure that young girls were not being coerced into unions against their will. Similar transformations occurred throughout the realm. Lady Eleanor of Brightwater, whose husband and 3 sons had died in the plague, discovered that she possessed a remarkable talent for managing the complex financial affairs of a large estate. Rather than remarrying as quickly as possible, as law and custom demanded, she successfully petitioned the crown for the right to remain unmarried and continue administering her lands independently. Her success inspired other widows to make similar requests, gradually establishing precedents that would eventually allow women greater legal autonomy. The economic changes brought about by the plague's devastation also began to undermine the financial foundations of the traditional marriage system. With labour scarce and valuable, young women found that they could command higher wages for their work, giving them a degree of economic independence that their mothers and grandmothers could never have imagined. The daughter of a wool spinner in Thornfield discovered that she could earn enough money working in the textile trade to support herself without needing a husband's protection, while the young women of Ravensburg began forming guilds of their own, creating economic networks that challenged the male monopoly on trade and commerce. Perhaps most significantly, the intellectual currents of the time began to shift in ways that would eventually challenge the theological and philosophical justifications for women's subjugation. The teachings of scholars like Master William of Ashford, who argued that women possessed rational souls equal to those of men, began to find audiences in the universities and monasteries. While these ideas were still considered radical and dangerous, they planted seeds of doubt about the divine order that had justified centuries of oppression. The rise of courtly love literature, though often romanticizing relationships that were still fundamentally unequal, nevertheless introduced revolutionary concepts about women's worth and dignity. The poems and songs that celebrated ladies as worthy of respect and devotion, however idealized and unrealistic, began to create cultural expectations that stood in stark contrast to the brutal realities of medieval marriage. Young men who had grown up hearing tales of knights who served their ladies with honour and devotion found it increasingly difficult to reconcile these ideals with the legal right to beat their wives into submission. In the castle of Silvermere, Lord Marquess of Whitehall shocked his contemporaries by publicly declaring that he would never raise his hand against his wife, Lady Catherine, because he considered such behaviour beneath the dignity of a true knight. While his stance was widely mocked by other nobles, it inspired similar declarations from younger lords who had been influenced by the changing cultural currents. These individual acts of conscience, while limited in scope, began to create a new model of masculine behaviour that would gradually gain acceptance over the following generations. The legal system itself began to show signs of evolution, driven partly by the practical needs of a society disrupted by plague and warfare, and partly by the persistent efforts of women who had learned to work within the system to achieve change. The case of Lady Margaret of Thornhaven, who successfully argued before the royal court that her marriage contract was invalid because she had been only 9 years old when it was signed, established important precedents about the age of consent and the validity of forced marriages. Mother Superior Adelheide's legal victories at the Abbey of St. Brigid had created ripple effects throughout the ecclesiastical courts, making it increasingly difficult for husbands to reclaim wives who had fled to religious sanctuaries. The Church's growing emphasis on marriage as a sacrament based on mutual consent, rather than simply a property transaction, began to provide legal grounds for challenging the most egregious abuses of the marriage system. The transformation was perhaps most visible in the next generation of women who had grown up witnessing their mothers' struggles and victories. The daughters of the women who had survived the worst brutalities of medieval marriage began to enter their own marriages with different expectations and a greater understanding of their rights. Young women like Isabella of Goldenhaven, whose mother had been one of the women helped by Lysandra's sisterhood, refused to accept marriage contracts that did not include provisions for their protection and dignity. These young women had learned from their mothers' experiences and had access to networks of support that previous generations could never have imagined. They knew which herbs could prevent unwanted pregnancies, which legal arguments could be used to challenge abusive husbands, and which convents would provide sanctuary if escape became necessary. Most importantly, they had grown up believing that they deserved better treatment than their mothers had received, and they were willing to fight for it. The merchant families of the growing cities began to recognize that educated daughters could be valuable assets in business dealings, leading to the establishment of schools that taught girls not only domestic skills but also reading, writing, and mathematics. These educated women became increasingly difficult to control through the traditional methods of intimidation and violence, as they understood their legal rights and had the skills necessary to advocate for themselves. The gradual shift in marriage practices can be seen in the wedding contracts of the late medieval period, which began to include provisions that would have been unthinkable centuries earlier. Brides began to negotiate for the right to maintain correspondence with their families, to have their own sources of income, and to be consulted about their children's future marriages. While these changes were still limited to the wealthy and well-connected, they represented a fundamental shift in the understanding of what marriage could and should be. The transformation of medieval marriage was neither complete nor universal by the end of the period, and countless women continued to suffer under the brutal system that had oppressed their sex for centuries. But the seeds of change had been planted by the courage of individual women, the necessities of economic and social upheaval, and the gradual evolution of ideas about human dignity and worth. The women who had endured the worst brutalities of the medieval marriage system had not suffered in vain. Their resistance, their networks of support, their small victories and tragic defeats had created the foundation for the gradual transformation that would eventually lead to a more just and humane understanding of marriage as a partnership between equals rather than the ownership of one human being by another. In the quiet chambers of Willowmere Castle, Lady Margaret sat with her granddaughter, teaching her to read from books that her own grandmother could never have imagined touching. The cycle of oppression was finally beginning to break, not through dramatic revolution, but through the patient accumulation of small changes that honoured the sacrifices of those who had come before while building hope for those yet to come. As we sit here in our modern world, surrounded by the comforts and freedoms that our medieval ancestors could never have imagined, it would be easy to dismiss these stories as relics of a barbaric past safely buried beneath centuries of progress and enlightenment. Yet the lessons embedded in these tales of suffering and survival speak to truths about human nature, power, and resilience that remain as relevant today as they were in the shadowed halls of Thornwick Castle or the humble cottages of Millhaven. The systematic oppression that defined medieval marriage was not an accident of history or the product of a uniquely cruel age, but rather the logical result of systems designed to concentrate power in the hands of a few while rendering others powerless. When we examine the legal codes that declared women to be property, the religious doctrines that justified their subjugation, and the economic structures that made their independence impossible, we see patterns that echo through every age and culture where inequality has been allowed to flourish unchallenged. Consider how the medieval practice of coverture, the legal doctrine that erased a woman's identity upon marriage, mirrors the countless ways that individuals throughout history have been rendered invisible by systems that refuse to acknowledge their full humanity. Whether we look at the enslaved peoples who were bought and sold like cattle, the indigenous populations whose cultures were systematically destroyed, or the workers whose labour built fortunes while they remained in poverty, we see the same fundamental dynamic: the powerful creating legal and social structures that define other human beings as less than fully human, the networks of support that medieval women created in the shadows, the whispered conversations at village wells, the secret remedies passed between midwives, the underground railways that helped women escape to convents, remind us that resistance has always taken many forms. In every generation, in every society where oppression has taken root, there have been those who refused to accept that suffering was inevitable, who found ways to help others even when they could not help themselves, who kept alive the dream of something better even in the darkest of times. When we read about Agnes Fairfax in her castle kitchen, teaching young women how to hide their bruises and protect their children, we might think of the modern advocates who run shelters for domestic violence survivors, who staff crisis hotlines, who work tirelessly to change laws and challenge systems that perpetuate abuse. The tools and methods have evolved, but the fundamental human impulse to protect the vulnerable and challenge injustice remains constant across the centuries. The courage displayed by women like Seraphina, who looked her abuser in the eye and declared her own worth, resonates powerfully in our contemporary world where individuals still struggle to find their voice in the face of systems designed to silence them. Every person who has ever stood up to a bully, who has refused to accept discrimination, who has spoken truth to power despite the personal cost, walks in the footsteps of those medieval women who chose defiance over submission even when the consequences could be deadly. The transformation that began in the late medieval period offers profound insights into how social change actually occurs. It was not the result of sudden revolution or the enlightenment of those in power, but rather the gradual accumulation of individual acts of resistance, economic necessities that forced the reconsideration of old assumptions, and the patient work of building new institutions and relationships that offered alternatives to the existing system. This pattern of change, slow, often invisible, built on the foundation of countless individual choices and small victories, challenges our modern tendency to expect immediate transformation and dramatic results. The women who spent decades building networks of support, who fought legal battles they knew they might not win, who planted seeds of change they would never see fully grow, understood something that we often forget: that meaningful progress requires patience, persistence, and the willingness to work for future generations rather than immediate gratification. The isolation that was so central to the medieval system of oppression, the deliberate separation of women from their families, friends, and communities of support, speaks directly to contemporary concerns about loneliness, alienation, and the breakdown of social connections. When we consider how modern technology and social structures can leave individuals feeling isolated and powerless, we might learn from the medieval women who understood that survival depended on finding ways to connect with others, to build relationships that could provide mutual support and shared strength. The economic dimensions of medieval marriage oppression also offer important lessons for our contemporary world. The fact that women could not own property, could not enter into contracts, could not support themselves independently, was not merely a cultural prejudice, but a carefully constructed system that ensured their continued dependence on male authority. When we examine modern economic inequalities, wage gaps, barriers to advancement, the feminization of poverty, we can see how economic control continues to be used as a tool of oppression, even in societies that have formally committed to equality. The role of religion and ideology in justifying medieval marriage brutality reminds us of how powerful institutions can be co-opted to serve the interests of oppression. The Church's teaching that women's suffering was divinely ordained, that submission was a virtue, that resistance was sinful, provided a moral framework that made the system seem not only natural but righteous. We see similar dynamics at work whenever religious or ideological systems are used to justify inequality, to discourage questioning of established power structures, or to make the oppressed complicit in their own subjugation. Perhaps most importantly, the stories of medieval women remind us that human beings possess an extraordinary capacity for resilience, courage, and hope, even in the most desperate circumstances. The fact that women like Lady Cordelia, Margot, and countless others managed to maintain their essential humanity despite systematic efforts to destroy their spirits speaks to something indestructible in the human soul that transcends any particular historical period or cultural context. The mother who continued to love her children despite being forbidden to protect them. The wife who secretly taught literacy to young girls despite the risk of punishment. The widow who used her small inheritance to help other women escape abusive marriages. These acts of love and courage remind us that even when we cannot change the systems that oppress us, we can still choose how we respond to them. We can still find ways to affirm the dignity and worth of ourselves and others. The gradual transformation of medieval marriage practices also offers hope for our contemporary struggles with injustice and inequality. Change is possible, systems can be reformed, and the seemingly invincible structures that perpetuate oppression can be challenged and ultimately transformed. But such change requires the same qualities that medieval women demonstrated: courage in the face of overwhelming odds, patience with slow progress, wisdom in choosing battles, and above all, an unshakable belief in the fundamental worth and dignity of every human being. As we face our own contemporary challenges, whether they involve gender equality, racial justice, economic fairness, or any of the other struggles for human dignity that define our time, we would do well to remember the lessons that the women of medieval Europe paid such a terrible price to teach us. Their suffering was not meaningless if we learn from it. Their courage was not wasted if it inspires us, and their gradual victories were not small if they helped create the foundation for the freedoms we enjoy today. And so, dear friend, we come to the end of our journey through the shadowed corridors of medieval marriage, having walked alongside women whose names history tried to forget, but whose spirits refused to be silenced. As the last candle flickers in the great hall of memory, and the echoes of their stories fade into the gentle quiet of this peaceful evening, we find ourselves forever changed by what we have witnessed together. Tonight, we have been privileged to serve as witnesses to some of the most profound demonstrations of human courage and resilience that history has to offer. We have seen young girls like Isadora and Margot face impossible circumstances with a dignity that humbles us, watched women like Seraphina and Lysandra transform their suffering into strength that could move mountains, and witnessed the quiet heroism of countless others who chose love over hatred, hope over despair, connection over isolation, even when the world around them seemed determined to crush every trace of light from their lives. Their stories remind us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act with love and dignity despite being afraid. When Lady Cordelia whispered to her sister to remember her as she truly was, when Margot packed her pressed flowers with trembling hands, when the women of Ravenscroft developed their silent language of support, they were not conquering their fear but choosing to be fully human in spite of it. They teach us that heroism is not found in grand gestures or dramatic victories, but in the daily choice to maintain one's humanity when everything around us conspires to strip it away. As you prepare for sleep tonight, perhaps you might carry with you the image of Dame Constance, the midwife who travelled from village to village, carrying not only the tools of her trade, but also the sacred stories of women who refused to be forgotten. In her leather satchel, alongside the herbs and remedies that eased physical pain, she carried something even more precious, the testimony that women's lives matter, that their struggles have meaning, that their quiet acts of resistance and love are worthy of remembrance and honour. Think too of Agnes Fairfax in her castle kitchen, stirring soup over the great hearth, while she whispered words of comfort and practical wisdom to the broken women who found sanctuary in her presence. She understood something that we might easily forget in our modern world of individual achievement and personal success. That sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply create a space where others feel safe enough to remember their own worth. The networks of support that these women built in secret, the messages passed between servants, the safe houses maintained by the Sisterhood of St. Catherine, the convents that defied authority to provide sanctuary, remind us that we are not meant to face our struggles alone. Even in our contemporary world, with all its technological marvels and social progress, we still need each other in ways that transcend time and circumstance. We still need the kind of community that Agnes created in her kitchen, the fierce loyalty that sustained Serafina in the mountains, the patient love that motivated Mother Superior Adelheid to fight legal battles she knew would take years to resolve. The transformation that began in the late medieval period, slow and often invisible as it was, offers us profound hope for our own capacity to create change in our world. The women who planted seeds they would never see fully grown, who built foundations for freedoms their grandchildren would enjoy, who chose to believe in possibilities they could barely imagine. They show us that meaningful progress often requires us to work not for immediate results, but for the benefit of those who will come after us. When we consider the young women of today who can choose their own partners, pursue their own careers, own property, vote, speak freely, and live lives of dignity and independence, we must remember that these freedoms were purchased with the suffering and sacrifice of countless women whose names we will never know. Every time a woman today walks away from an abusive relationship, every time she stands up for herself in the workplace, every time she raises her daughter to believe in her own worth and potential, she honours the memory of those medieval women who endured the unendurable, so that future generations might have better choices. But perhaps the most important lesson these women offer us is not about grand historical progress or social transformation, but about something much more intimate and immediate, the power we each possess to choose love over hatred, courage over cowardice, connection over isolation, hope over despair, regardless of our circumstances. When Margot helped her friend Eliza despite knowing her own life was about to be destroyed, when Lady Rosalind risked everything to save her daughter, when countless unnamed women shared their last crust of bread with someone hungrier than themselves, they were not changing the world in any measurable way, but they were changing everything that truly matters. They were choosing to see the divine spark in others when the world told them such people were worthless. They were insisting on the fundamental dignity of human beings when every law and custom declared otherwise. They were practicing a kind of love that recognized no boundaries of class or status, that asked nothing in return, that persisted even when it seemed to make no difference at all. As you drift towards sleep tonight, surrounded by the safety and comfort that their sacrifices helped make possible, you might offer them the gift of your gratitude, not the formal gratitude of historical acknowledgement, but the living gratitude of a life well lived, relationships built on respect and equality, choices made with consciousness of how precious freedom truly is. And if you find yourself facing your own challenges, whether they involve relationships that need healing, injustices that need addressing, or simply the daily struggle to maintain hope and kindness in a world that can seem harsh and uncaring, remember that you carry within yourself the same indomitable spirit that sustained Serafina in the mountains, that gave Lysandra the patience to plan her elaborate escape, that allowed countless women to find joy and meaning even in the darkest circumstances. You are their descendant not just in body but in spirit, heir to their courage, beneficiary of their love, keeper of their flame. The light they refuse to let the darkness extinguish burns on in you, in your capacity for compassion, your instinct for justice, your ability to see the sacred worth of every human being you encounter. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the shadows of history, for listening with an open heart to stories that needed to be told, for honouring with your attention the women who deserve so much better than the world gave them. If these tales have touched your heart, if they have reminded you of the preciousness of freedom and the power of human connection, I hope you'll share them with others who might also benefit from their wisdom. The gentle women of medieval times would be amazed to know that centuries after their deaths, strangers would gather in the quiet of evening to remember their stories, to honour their struggles, to draw strength from their example. In remembering them, we ensure that their light continues to shine, that their courage continues to inspire, that their love continues to heal. Sleep well tonight, dear friend, wrapped in the warmth of community that stretches across centuries, cradled by the knowledge that you are part of an unbroken chain of human beings who have chosen light over darkness, love over hatred, hope over despair. And may you wake tomorrow with renewed appreciation for the freedoms you enjoy, the choices you can make, and the power you possess to create a world where every person is valued, respected, and free to write their own story of love and dignity. Sweet dreams, and may the spirits of those brave women watch over your rest, blessing you with the peace they fought so hard to imagine, and the courage they showed us is always possible, no matter how dark the night may seem. In the quiet moments after our story ends, as the last echoes of medieval voices fade into the peaceful darkness of your chamber, there remains one final gift that these long-departed women would want to leave with you. Not another tale of suffering or triumph, but something simpler and more precious. A benediction whispered across the centuries from their hearts to yours. Picture them now, not as the broken figures we sometimes encountered in their darkest hours, but as they truly were in their essence. Seraphina standing tall on her mountain peak, breathing free air and watching the sunrise paint the world in colours of hope. Lysandra in her final years, surrounded by the hundreds of women whose lives she'd saved, her eyes bright with the satisfaction of battles well fought. Mother Superior Adelheid in her convent garden, teaching young girls to read by candlelight, her face serene with the knowledge that every word they learned was a small victory against ignorance and oppression. See Dame Constance in her twilight years, no longer travelling the dangerous roads between villages but sitting peacefully by her hearth, writing down the stories of all the women she'd helped, ensuring their courage would never be forgotten. Watch Agnes Fairfax, finally free from service, tending her own small garden where she grows the herbs that once provided comfort to the desperate, now sharing her knowledge freely with any who seek healing. And there, in the shadow of memory that has become light, stands young Margot, not as we last saw her, worn down by suffering, but as she exists now, in the realm where all pain has ended and all tears have been wiped away. She holds in her hands the pressed flowers that were once burned, restored to eternal beauty, and her laughter rings out clear and true as it did in those precious days before her world grew dark. They gather now in this twilight space between story and sleep, these women who refuse to be defeated by darkness, and they speak as one voice across the void of time. Dear child of a gentler age, as you rest your head tonight on pillows soft with the freedom our struggles help to purchase, know that every breath you draw in peace is a prayer answered. Every choice you make in love is a victory we could only dream of. Every moment you live in dignity is a flame lit from the fire we kept burning in our hearts when all seemed lost. We do not ask you to carry our burdens, for those died with us long ago. We do not ask you to avenge our wrongs, for justice has its own mysterious ways of unfolding across the centuries. We ask only that you remember us not with sorrow but with joy. Joy that darkness did not triumph, that love proved stronger than hatred, that the human spirit you carry within yourself proved indestructible even when tested by the cruelest trials. When you wake tomorrow and feel the morning sun warm upon your face, think of us and smile, knowing that we too loved sunrises, that we too found beauty in simple things, that we too dreamed of days when children could grow up free from fear. When you choose kindness over cruelty, when you extend your hand to help another, when you stand up for what is right even when it costs you something, you honour our memory better than any monument of stone ever could. And when your own trials come, for they come to all who dare to live fully and love deeply, remember that you carry within yourself the same strength that sustained us, the same light that guided us, the same unquenchable hope that made our suffering meaningful. You are stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and more loved than you can imagine, not only by those who share your present world, but by us who have gone before and who watch with gladness as you write new chapters in the endless story of human courage and compassion. As their voices fade into the gentle rustle of night wind through ancient trees, as their forms dissolve into the soft darkness that cradles all peaceful endings, they leave behind not sadness, but a profound sense of completion, of stories told and wisdom shared, of love that transcends time and space to touch your heart with blessing. The last sound you might hear, if you listen very carefully as sleep draws near, is the faint echo of women's voices raised not in lamentation but in the ancient song of triumph, the melody that celebrates not what was lost but what was preserved, not what was broken but what remains whole, not what ended but what continues forever in the endless dance of memory, love, and hope. Rest now, dear listener, knowing that you have been entrusted with something precious, the stories of those who came before, the wisdom of those who suffered that others might be free, the blessing of those who chose light in the deepest darkness. Sleep peacefully in the warmth of their love, and may your dreams be filled with the gentle laughter of children playing in meadows where fear has no power, where every person is valued for the unique light they bring to the world, where love reigns supreme over all the earth, and perhaps, in the mystery of dreams, you might find yourself walking once more through those medieval landscapes we explored together, but this time seeing them transformed by love, healed by time, blessed by the triumph of all that is good and true and beautiful in the human heart. For that is the world these women dreamed of, worked toward, and ultimately made possible through their courage, their sacrifice, and their unshakable faith in the promise of dawn after even the longest night. Good night, dear friend. Sleep well, dream beautifully, and wake refreshed, carrying their blessing into another day of freedom, choice, and infinite possibility. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.